recent decades in the social sciences, there's been what's been referred to as a turn to language that is represented perhaps most of all in the current popularity of discourse analysis in its various forms as a method of qualitative data analysis. Now, this turn to language means that the use of language and other symbolic systems, which have a kind of meaningful structure to them, are seen as a major focus of what we investigate in the social sciences. And there are two key issues that arise from this turn to language. First of all, that language is not just descriptive of the world, and sometimes, in fact, not at all descriptive of the world. Rather, language is a social activity in itself. And secondly, language use is influenced by and influences the wider society, especially its power structures. And we'll see that perhaps most of all when I talk about Foucault's discourse analysis in a later session. In fact, language constructs our social world for most discourse analysis. So it's not just simply influenced by, but it actually influences our social world. Now, the origins of this turn to language can be seen in a few major philosophers and writers in the social sciences. And I'm going to talk about three of those here: Wittgenstein, John Austin and Harvey Sachs. So to begin with, Wittgenstein, a philosopher, a Viennese philosopher who spent most of his time actually working in Britain, in Cambridge. His early work was a rejection of the kind of view that we now see in discourse analysis. In fact, the early work, the Tractatus, that was the book he wrote that summarised this, the Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus, had what Wittgenstein called a picture theory of language. Language essentially was describing the world. It was through pictures that it got its meaning about the world. Now, this was the view that he rejected later on in his life after he fought in the First World War, and he wrote this up in the Tractatus. He came to reject that view, and gradually over the decades that followed, and when he particularly came back to Cambridge, he developed a new approach to the philosophy of language, which rejected that view that language in some way was descriptive of the world. On the contrary, he said, language is more like playing a number of games. The focus is on how words are used in language and in our actions and activities, rather than on what they are describing. So the use of language became a primary focus of this later view of language. He realised that this was important because many of the words that we use don't simply describe the world. And in the Tractatus himself, he recognised this towards the end, that words of aesthetics, of moral philosophy, of ethics and so on, didn't describe things in the world, and yet they seem to have meaning. And in fact, you can go further than that. There are lots of other words in English, even simple logical terms like and or and if, which don't actually describe anything in the world, and yet are absolutely crucial for the meaning of our language. So description was in no sense possible as a way of explaining meaning, and this is why he came back to this view that it was the language use that mattered, and the way we use those in our social lives that determined the use of words and their meaning. And around about the same time that Wittgenstein was writing, perhaps a little bit later as well, into the 1950s, another British philosopher was writing, John Austin. And in particular, he came up with a book that was called How to Do Things with Words. And what he suggested was that many speech acts, and notice the very terminology itself, speech acts, these are doing things with words, are not describing, rather they are doing things. So it's not just a rejection of description as not a complete view of language, rather in Austin's case, a recognition that actually there were lots and lots of things that language was doing that weren't description at all. At the simple level, he meant things like the command, come here, or the judgment in a court that says guilty, or when somebody says, I promise to do something. These terms and these uses of language, these speech acts, as Austin put it, are not describing things in the world, they're doing something else. They are commanding, or they are judging, or they are promising, and so on. In fact, Austin went further than that and suggested that even what apparently might be descriptive language is actually doing other things. And in most cases, actually description is doing other things, and perhaps even not describing anything at all, but rather achieving something else. And we'll see some examples of that a little bit later on. The other major source, I think, of discourse analysis ideas was the work of Harvey Sachs and one or two other conversation analysts. Harvey Sachs was looking in really quite detailed way at speech and real dialogues. One particular example he looked at was calls to the Los Angeles Suicide Prevention Center, and he looked at how the call handlers dealt with these, of course, quite sensitive discussions on the telephone with people who were potentially going to commit suicide. And he looked at detail of how the kind of work people did when talking, the way they took turns, the way they expected certain kinds of replies to be given to things they'd said, the way they responded in certain kinds of ways, and how they managed that whole thing of a conversation and kept the dialogue going. How they knew what to say and how to respond and so on. And that's been developed into a large variety of fields, and that's now effectively the focus of conversation analysis. I'm not going to say much more about conversation analysis in this session, but it is an underpinning, I think, of a lot of discursive analysis, the approaches used, and particularly, for example, the way that transcripts are produced to be used in conversation analysis is often used in discourse analysis as well. Now, all of these influences have been brought together, particularly in the late 80s and into the 1990s, by a range of people writing about discourse analysis, initially in the social sciences, but then out into the media studies and cultural studies and so on, a huge range of things. They'd examined discourse, and what for them discourse was language in a social life. And for them it was going from description to action. Not the common sense view, so not seeing language as a description of the world, in a sense working with Wittgenstein, that rejection of his early view about language as picturing the world, but rather seeing discourses and language use as a form of social activity itself, a form of social action. So in analysing those actions and in analysing the social interactions, we are seeing language use as activities, as things people are doing. Now this brings us to a range of definitions of what a discourse is, and it does vary depending upon the different kind of approaches taken by people. A discourse at one level is, if you like, at the smallest level, is seen as a conversation or a text. And particularly some of the discursive psychologists tend to focus on what are called naturalistic text or discourses, which are things that happen naturally, not the result of a researcher collecting data through an interview, for example, or an observation, but rather things that would happen anyway, even if the researcher weren't there. And these are called naturalistic texts. So at one level, discourse is a conversation or text in that sense. At a slightly larger level, a discourse is seen as a collection of those texts or conversations. And they may be naturalistically occurring, or there may be other kinds of texts that start to get included here, things like things that people have written, or speeches they have given, or other kinds of occurrences of meaningful things like images and videos and so on. A discourse can also be used to refer to the shared way of talking or creating those texts, the code, if you like, that determines that way of talking about the world. So the discourse is seen as some kind of overarching social phenomenon, which is then manifest in particular ways, in particular conversations and dialogues and so on. Now, in that sense, we often refer to discourses, the plural. which recognises that these codes, these languages, these ways of speaking of a topic may be occurring in various different ways, in various different forms. And so discourses is often referred to by discourse analysts to refer to these different kinds of discourses that occur, maybe used by the same people, but often used by different people in different institutions in different circumstances. So the term discourse has that range of meanings, and often discourse analysts move from one to the other without indicating what they're doing. Just to fill that out a bit more detail, here are a few definitions of discourses. One from John Fiske, talking about in the context of media studies, says a discourse is a language or system of representation that is developed socially in order to make and circulate a coherent set of meanings about an important topic area. That's a very kind of neutral kind of way of putting it, but it does include all those aspects of meaning and topics and representation that a discourse has. The second definition comes from Wikipedia, and I've included it here because it includes a quite interesting example, which I think will become clearer as we go through both this session and when I talk about Foucauldian discourse analysis, about the contested nature of some discourses and the conflicting nature of some discourses. Wikipedia says, in the social sciences, a discourse is considered to be an institutionalised way of thinking, a social boundary defining what can be said about a specific topic. Discourses are seen to affect our views on all things. In other words, it is not possible to escape discourse. For example, two distinctly different discourses can be used about various guerrilla movements, describing them either as freedom fighters or as terrorists. In other words, the chosen discourse delivers the vocabulary, expressions, and perhaps also the style needed to communicate. So that notion, freedom fighters as against terrorists, two different discourses here in conflict, perhaps used by different people about the same individuals, the same guerrilla movements being referred to in these different ways by these different discourses for different reasons. I'll come back to a lot of that as we go through this session and the one on Foucauldian analysis as well. Now, as I think is clear by now, and I've mentioned this several times, there is not one single discourse analysis. Rather, there are varieties of discourse analysis available to us. And it changes across different disciplines, so linguistic, psychology, sociology, philosophy have different kinds of approaches, and there are different schools. And here are some of those schools of discourse analysis and some of the names associated with them. So we have text linguistics, associated with Halliday, Van Dyck, Huey, ethnomethodology, perhaps a very old approach, associated with Sachs, who I've mentioned already, and Goffman. Conversation analysis, I've mentioned that. Narrative analysis, semiotics, deconstruction, critical discourse analysis, multimodal analysis, discursive psychology, and I'll say a lot more about that a little bit later on, and cognitive models or frame analysis. In fact, the Foucauldian approach might be seen as quite close to the critical discourse analysis approach, and Fairclough himself recognises at least one of the origins of thinking in critical discourse is Foucault's work. I'm not going to talk about all of these in this session, but I'm going to focus on two. And those are, first of all, discourse analysis in social psychology, now usually referred to as discursive psychology. Started by Potter and Wetherell back in 1987 and developed by Potter and Edwards and others, Edley and Wetherell herself, of course, over many, many years. And secondly, I'm going to talk about Foucauldian, or perhaps might be referred to as critical discourse analysis. There's a certain degree of overlap here. I'll talk mainly about Foucault, but this has similar kind of connotations to the work of Fairclough, Vodak, Van Dyck and so on. Just to give you some idea of the differences between these two, here's a little table identifying some of the key differences of these two approaches. The Potter and Wetherell approach, you might say the discursive psychology approach, is based upon a micro-sociology, ethnomethodology perhaps, the most clear-cut source of that approach. Whereas Foucault's approach is very much a post-structuralist approach based on a kind of critique of Marxism, a post-structuralism, and perhaps continental philosophy. In terms of the focus, Potter and Wetherell and discursive psychology focuses very much upon linguistic practice, what people actually do in interaction. As I said earlier on, very often there's a focus on naturalistic speech, the occurrence of dialogues and discourses in natural settings. And it's focused on that actual practice, what people actually do with their words and with the discourse. In contrast, in Foucauldian approach, there's much more focus on linguistic resources, the resources people have available to the discourses that exist, in a sense, before they are born, perhaps before they come into use of those words, and which are available to them and which give them their social positions. These things are called subject positions in Foucauldian approaches. So there's a focus much more on a range of discourses, here, not just the practice of people speaking, but also the other kinds of texts that they draw upon, particularly written texts, and of course the media, which includes visual texts as well. And so in terms of the method, you might find a similar distinction. The Potter and Wetherell, the discursive psychology approach, tends to start with a transcript and work upwards from that, so from the micro level upwards, whereas in a Foucauldian approach, we tend to start with transcripts and work downwards to illustrate theory from those. So we start with the grand discourses that exist. Okay, I'm going to concentrate for the moment at least on discursive psychology, and there are some key terms which occur here which it's important to understand and know about. Interpretative repertoire is the first of those. Discourse analysis refers to the kinds of terminology, phrases, metaphors and so on available in our culture which we can use. And those are called the interpretative repertoire, the sense of a repertoire of terminology that we can bring to bear in our discourses. And they may vary from people to people, from situation to situation. They may indicate different cultural differences, for example, but often they are drawn upon by a range of people, so that they are held in common between people, those repertoires. A second term, which is also shared by the Foucauldian approach, is subject positions. These are available ways to understand our own position or to occupy in a discussion in the use of a discourse, or in a Foucauldian sense, to occupy in society. The discursive psychology approach tends to use subject positions more in terms of its use within a discourse, whereas for Foucault and Foucauldian approaches, they are much more subject positions that may be occupied within institutions, within society, within the broader realm of social activity and social action. And then thirdly, a key term here is that of ideological dilemmas. The interpretive repertoire can itself be contradictory, both within one person's repertoire and one person's discourse. We may find contradictions, things that don't always agree with each other, and we aren't always consistent in the way that we use our discourses. But of course, in a Foucauldian sense, there can be several different discourses which themselves can be contradictory and contrast with each other and undermine each other. So these ideological dilemmas occur both at the individual level within a particular discourse or within a particular discussion or dialogue, and also between discourses at the social level. Okay, let me turn to a bit more about discursive psychology itself, and I'll focus very much on that from now onwards in this session. As I said, it's associated with the names of Potter and Wetherell as some of the originators of this approach, but they weren't necessarily the only ones. There are others who followed up that work and developed it. The major approach they took was a rejection of what was then the dominant view in psychology, that of cognitivism. It's important, I think, to understand the role of that rejection. Cognitivism in psychology is the idea that people behave as they do as a result of cognitive states, which their beliefs describe. So there's some sense in which they have these cognitive states which might reside inside the brain, for example, which they can in some sense describe. That when you ask them about these things, the words they use are in some sense describing these cognitive states or have some reference to these cognitive states. So for a cognitivist rather, to strive to find out what the person has experienced is to ask them questions. You have to ask them to do that. What the participant says may be an accurate portrayal, but it might not be. It might be something else. It might be something which they haven't properly, correctly experienced or believed. So there's a possibility of mistake in doing that. So for cognitivism, people's language is a way of describing these inner cognitive states, and of course because of this notion of description they could be mistaken about it. Now both those views are rejected by discursive psychologists. For them, language is not a passive reflection of the external world, rather it is a site for doing reality, not the way of describing it, but a way of doing things in the world. Language performs actions. Hello performs a greeting. I promise performs a promise, and so on. And we can see that right from the very origins of discourse analysis by looking at this extract number 1, of a telephone call between two sisters, Agnes and Nancy, in America in the 1960s. And you'll see here in the extract itself, I've used a particular way of transcribing the text here, which uses particular underlinings and colons and H's in brackets to indicate various aspects of how things are said. So underlining indicates that words or part of a word is stressed. The colons indicate an elongation of a vowel sound, and the number of colons indicating that the longer it's emphasised, the longer it's elongated. And the H's indicate in-breaths or breathing between words, often in brackets to indicate that. So what you've got here, and I'm going to make some attempt of describing how it's said, but I won't do it very well, is Nancy saying on the phone, "Hello," and then Agnes says, "Hi." Notice the elongation of the hi there. And then Nancy says, "Oh, hi. How are you, Agnes?" And Agnes says, "Fine. Your line's been busy." And Nancy says, "Yeah, my father's wife called me." And then she breathes in again. "So when she calls me, I always talk for a long time because she can afford it and I can't." And then she breathes in again and sighs. Now, for a discourse analyst, the first question here is, what are the actions going on here? What things are happening in this little piece of speech? Remember, for discourse analysts, the use of discourse is itself an action. Another way of putting that is to say which parts of the extract or which turns are descriptive and so could be tested for truth, and which aren't. And it does look as if there are some descriptions going on here. In fact, two things are said. One is, your line's been busy, and the other, my father's wife called me. So one is Agnes saying your line's been busy, and the other is Nancy explaining that her father's wife called her. So it looks like that there are at least some descriptions going on here. But it also clearly does things too. In this little piece of speech you can see there's greeting going on, there's how are you, hello being said, and so on. And that's happening as well. Now, Austin, in his original work on the use of language, how to do things with words, and then Potter and Wetherell later on talking about their social psychology of discourse, suggests that it's too simple to say that there's both these things going on. There's a bit of description, descriptive talk, your line's been busy, and a bit of other things going on as well. What they in fact suggest here is it's not really description at all. It looks like a description, but actually Agnes is doing something else here. She's not simply or even at all describing something. What she's doing is something else. Agnes is really asking perhaps a possibility, a variety of other things. She's asking, who were you talking to? It's an implicit question. She's not asking it explicitly, but she is fishing for information. Or maybe she's trying to show that she's been trying to call before. She's trying to tell Nancy that she has been trying, even though she may not realise it. Or maybe she's asking implicitly if something's up. I've been trying to get in touch with you. Why can't I get in touch with you? The line is not normally that busy, perhaps she's saying. So she's indicating some kind of implicit question here. Or maybe she's just letting Nancy know that Agnes knows that Nancy's been making lots of calls and so on. Of course, Nancy knows that. She's been making the calls. But Agnes is letting Nancy know that she knows that as well. Or maybe all of those things are going on. But you can see there's a variety of activities that could be happening here, that could be going on in both implicit and explicit fashions. Now, if it was a simple question, if Agnes had simply said, why can't I get hold of you, or what's going on, then Nancy could have replied, that's right, the line was busy, and confirmed the description. But in fact, Nancy doesn't do that. Nancy recognises this isn't a description. She isn't asking whether the line was busy or not, because they both know that. Nancy actually answers the implicit question and says who was calling her. So it looks as if Nancy has understood that this was an implicit question, not at all a description about the line. So Nancy understands your line's been busy as asking, who were you talking to? And so that's what she answers she gives. She actually tells Agnes who she was talking to on the phone. So in this case, it's not actually a description going on at all. It's an asking, an inquiring. It's an action that's being undertaken. Let's look at another example of that. Extract number 2. In this case, it's about a group of young people, for students, discussing a noise that they've heard outside their flat, outside the door. And it starts with B saying, "Oi, could have been that." And then N, whoever N is, says, "No, that's not making a noise." And by the way, the brackets here, the square brackets, indicate overlapping speech. So it's the same time as N finishes the sentence saying that's not making a noise. A says, "No, something outside." And then there's a gap of about 4/10 of a second. And then A says again, "It was definitely outside." And then D says, "Neil, you've got shoes on," as a way of moving the conversation on. What's going on here? Why does D suddenly say, "Neil, you've got shoes on"? And what's trying to go on there? Looks like D is telling Neil, presumably N is Neil, that he's got shoes on. Well, he already knows that. And so can the others. The others can see that as well. What's interesting about that? What's trying to be achieved by that? It's not a description. What is happening, of course, is that D is implicitly asking Neil to go outside to investigate the noise. But why do it implicitly? What's the function of asking implicitly? Why is the activity done in this particular way, a discourse analyst would ask? So in this case, the questions for analysis are, why does D ask Neil to go outside implicitly? Why not just simply say, "You go outside then"? Why not order him to? And why does D explain to Neil that he should go because he's got shoes on? Why does D do it that way? Well, I think we can identify at least 2 linguistic practices here in this "Neil, you've got shoes on" phrase. Clearly there's an implicit request. That's one meaning it has. And secondly, it's the explaining about the shoes. What's that saying? What's that doing? It's not just simply a description. So let's look at the first of those, the implicit request. The function and effect of this is that it's implicit and it doesn't actually order Neil around. It obeys the social norms of a group of friends, that you don't tell somebody to go and do something. You tell a small child, perhaps. You tell an inferior in some kind of military organisation to do something. But a group of friends don't act like that. So it has the effect of asking someone to do something, but it does it by obeying those social norms about not making it an explicit request or even a command. And secondly, there's the explanation that Neil has shoes on, in a sense the blindingly obvious. Everyone can see that's the case, although they may not have noticed it before Dee said so. What this does, the functions this has, it explains why the speaker shouldn't be going. Maybe they didn't have shoes on, or maybe they didn't have the kind of shoes you could walk around outside on. And it also explains that the reason is not because they're a coward or because they're afraid to go out, but rather simply the practicalities of Neil has the right shoes to go outside. If you put it another way, their identity is at stake here. They're not identifying themselves as some kind of coward or lazy person. Rather, they're saying it's the practicalities that determine that Neil should go out, not themselves. So they're doing those two things at the same time. They're both avoiding giving an explicit command, and they're also identifying themselves as someone who is not a coward. It is just simply practicalities that means that somebody else should go. So you can see, very simple phrases, a lot going on in the discourse. So we have these basic concepts already from our analysis of discursive psychology. First of all, the discursive action, which is questioning, explaining and so on. I've given some examples of those already. And then we have the linguistic practices and constructions, how the action is being done. Of all the different ways it could be done, certain ways are chosen. And often several different things are going on at the same time in what is being said. So those practices, those constructions, construct the world in a certain kind of way and give impressions to others about who we are, how we'd like to be seen, about what we're trying to do, and so on. And there are others as well that discourse psychologists refer to. One of those is variation. Words used vary by context. The different contexts mean we use different vocabularies, different language, different texts, different terminology, different metaphors, and so on. And we can see this by this the next example, a kind of made-up example. Imagine, for example, you went to a party and by accident had so much to drink that you and a group of friends you were with went for a dip in the city centre water fountain and got caught by the police for disruptive behaviour or something. Think about how you would describe those events of going out, drinking, getting in the fountain and so on to your friends, and then perhaps how you describe it to the judge in court the next day. Clearly you come up with two different kinds of stories here. For speaking to the friends, you would be telling a funny story. And you would construct the event as a kind of a good laugh, with some outrageous behaviour perhaps, but otherwise, just a good laugh. Whereas in court, of course, your action would be trying to avoid a fine and trying to placate the judiciary. So you would construe the event, you would construct the event as probably some kind of stupid behaviour for which you were very sorry. You tell a quite different story. So it looks like here what you've got is two contradictory descriptions of the same events. But of course, as far as a discourse analyst is concerned, it's not rather descriptions. It is that you have two different discourses and you're trying to achieve two different kinds of effects. So the discourse analyst sees language as doing different activities here. That describing things to your friends and engaging your friends in a good story is a different kind of activity from trying to avoid a fine in a court of law. There is no need, say the discourse analyst, to decide which of these is the true description because they're both activities in our discursive life. They're different activities discursively. And as the discursive activity changes, so will the construction of events, the beliefs, the objects in it, and so on. And this is called variation. This different kinds of discourses used to achieve different kinds of things, to do different kinds of things with language, is called variation. It appears that they're about the same things, but in fact variation gives us a quite different view of what's happening. And we can see this in real life too. Here's an example from Wetherell and Potter's work. They interviewed 17 final year students aged between 20 and 23 years old and asked them how having a child would affect work. And here's a couple of extracts from one of those respondents. The same person, A, said both these things at different points in their discussion. First of all, the extract number 3, the sexist view, A said, the mother should be looking after the child and bringing it up, and certainly for the first 5 years. And yet, at some other time, extract 4, A said something different, the equitable view. A said, there should be equalities for both men and women in the workplace. Now, it looks as if they're both both these examples being described as describing the same thing, the same person, but contradictory viewpoints by the same person. Same person believes one thing and believes something different. But what the discourse analysts do is link this with the activity, link the construction with the activity. It's not that the person has two contradictory views, rather they're trying to do two different things in these uses of language, in these discourses. And to find that out, we have to ask what activities are being carried out here. What effect does it have? Why are things being said this way? And it's often helpful to look at the context in which things are being said. And let's do that now. Let's look at extract 5, which is the context in which extract 3 was actually said. So here's that longer extract. A said, I think women should look after the children for the sake of the balanced, mature upbringing for the child. In other words, there must, in the ideal world, there must be both a father there and a mother there. And the mother should be looking after the child and bringing it up, and certainly for the first 5 years. And you can see in red is the text that I used before. That's the sexist view, if you like, coming out here. Now, what the discourse analysts, what Wetherell and Potter said about this, was that what's going on here, how are we meant to understand this situation? How is it constructed? Well, A is discussing general views about how to raise a child and presents a kind of ideal version that's pro-child in this version, based upon conventional understandings of gender, the common sense views, if you like, or the ordinary views about mothers and fathers and raising children. But the ideal version is focused on the child. And that's the context for what they're saying here. Now, extract 6 shows the context of the equality version that the extract 4 came from. So here's extract 6, and you can see a different kind of context is happening here. It starts with the interviewer asking a question. The interviewer says, so if it was a decision between you and your wife as to who was to stay at home, you would rather go to work than stay at home? And then A replies, well, no. That would have to be a unanimous decision. In other words, if my wife was adamant that she wanted to go out to work and I were 90% convinced that I wanted to go out to work, then it is possible that I would look after the children. The point is just to have the essential correct ethics behind it all. In other words, that there should be qualities for both men and women in the workplace. So in this case, we can see it's a response to a question. The context is very different. A here is defending himself against the implicit criticism from the interviewer that he might be being sexist. So in suggesting that you would rather go to work than stay at home, the interviewer is suggesting that A would ignore the wishes of his wife. So he is constructing a version of practical real-life issues that's pro-equality and not sexist as a response to that question, or that implicit criticism from the interviewer. So we can see in the discourse analyst's terms, the variation happens, but the variation is not two contrasting descriptions, rather it's two actions, two activities the person is doing, in this case, in the case of the example about childcare, to describe either an ideal type of childcare situation or to counteract the implicit accusation from the interviewer that they might be being sexist. So to summarise then, these different constructions are linked to different activities. And what's going on here, the discourses are the activities themselves, and that is why they are different. The contradiction is between liberal practice and being sexist. But in fact, interestingly, Wetherell and Pottle in this work reported that some 2/3 of the interviewees expressed similar contradictions in what they said when placed to do different things in their discourses. So it's not an unusual variation in language use. Now, another area that discourse analysts look at, and particularly discursive psychologists look at, is factual talk. Now, I've already given some examples of that where it looks like someone's giving a fact. But very often we have to do that. We have to give some facts. We have to describe things and say what's happening and what's going on. But this is work without problems, because we have to try and convince the listener, that's what we're doing by saying these things, that this is happening or that had happened and so on. And listeners become convinced because of a whole range of discursive techniques we use in order to support our factual claims. One of those, for example, is when you're talking about somebody that you might want to criticise, you will start by saying, I really like John, but, which indicates in some sense that you're on John's side, but you can recognise these things nevertheless. So you're not so much being critical of him, although perhaps you are, but you're nevertheless, in some sense, countering that by convincing the listener that what you're saying must be right, because although you're actually, you like John a lot, you're still making these critical comments. So discourse analysis then studies the way people do this, the way they make their talk appear factual, their, if you might call them, factualization devices. And let's look at some of those. There are two main ideas that are often used by discourse analysts here. One of those is concerned with stake and interest and how we control that and manipulate that, and the other is concerned with independence. So let's start by looking at stake and interest. This refers to the ways that what we say may sometimes be heard as self-interested. In other words, you would say that, wouldn't you? The kind of person you are, the kind of things you've done, of course you'd say that. And we want to try and counter that accusation, that we're not self-interested. Now, of course, this can be a real problem for some people. You imagine the salesman trying to sell you windows, who tells you the windows are the cheapest you'll find. If they just simply said that, you'd be thinking to yourself, well, they would say that, wouldn't they? They're trying to sell me the windows. They'll benefit from their description being true because I'll buy their windows if they're the best ones. Or secondly, we might in some way indicate that we're biased. You don't like the politics of the person you're talking about, so you pick on their bad points. And again, we want to try and counter that view. We want to try and give the impression that we're not biased against people, although we might be thought as such. So how can we reduce this apparent stake that we might have in a particular viewpoint, or a particular interest we might have in a particular viewpoint? How can we establish the claim as more of a kind of fact about the person? Well, that's called managing stake by the discourse analysts. And to look at that and how it's done, let's look at an example of another piece of text, a psychic R talking about the ghost of an ambulance man who visited her and asked her to deliver a message to his wife. So there's a longer conversation of which this is a part. And here's the extract number 7. R says, I was working in a hospital with a lot of other people that were with me. And the interviewer says, And R carries on. And we lived in like a kind of village, you see. She paused a bit and carried on and said, and I'd been into this kind of spiritualism for a few years, but I wasn't really interested in it. It was just that these things kept calling on me. So, what we got here then is various kinds of uses of language, and in particular, let's have a look at lines 8 to 10 of that extract, where R says, I've been into this kind of spiritualism for a few years. And then says, but I wasn't really interested in it. Apparently contradicting herself, apparently saying one thing and then saying the opposite. But what's going on here is a problem of stake. She's managing the stake in this. She's trying to convince the listener, the interviewer, that despite being into spiritualism, she's still a reliable voice or a reliable witness about what's going on. So, on the one hand, she's trying to manage the stake by saying that she was into spiritualism. For you has to say that because that describes who she is and what she's been doing. So the suggestion is she might be biased, she believes in ghosts, she would see that, after all she's a psychic and so on. So we can see that that's one implication. On the other hand, she says, I wasn't really interested. And so she's minimising that stake. She's giving herself a kind of disinterested position of an observer of what these things that were happening. So she's managing her stake by bringing in this apparently contradictory element into what she says. She was into it, but she wasn't really interested. So the contradiction arises in the attempt to minimise stake. Saying I wasn't interested is one way of doing this, and the technical term that discourse analysts use for this is a disclaimer. We make a disclaimer that in some sense undermines what we've just been saying, but we do that in order to minimise the stake, the apparent self-interest that we have in this statement. So the stake management directly addresses the issues of self-interest. It focuses on the speaker, I wasn't interested in it, and it helps persuade the listener that what's being said is factual. It is trying to establish factuality. Now that's one way in which we try to establish factuality. Another is that of independence and the problem of independence. And this is a way of drawing attention away from the speaker, establishing a distance from the speaker. The speaker's saying one thing, but there can be independent sources of what they're saying that indicate some kind of support for that as well. And it can be done in a variety of ways. Potter illustrates this problem of independence in a variety of different ways. Look at this one, for example. Extract number 7, again. The same psychic, who said on line 10, it was just that these things kept calling on me. What does this imply, and what effect is going on here? Well, there's a kind of distancing happening here. She's kind of distancing herself from the things that she's describing. Things just kept calling on me. She didn't do anything. They were calling on her. It wasn't her actions, it was something from outside. It downplays her role and, in a sense, upplays the idea that it was some other independent source of things that was causing this. It wasn't her activities, rather it came from outside. But that's not the only way of doing things. It can happen, this kind of way of constructing independence can happen in other ways too. And one key way in which that can be done is by getting other people to agree with you, or to actually bring to mind or to bring into the conversation their agreement in some sense, to bring evidence that corroborates what you've done from other people. As Popper puts it here, the crucial feature of everyday reasoning about facts is that consensus in reporting provides corroboration of the factuality of a version. If one witness to a car accident claims the driver was going too fast, they may be discounted. However, if most or all witnesses claim this, they are likely to be more convincing. So the more voices saying the same things, the more convincing that the factual claims appear to be. So how do we do that? What kinds of ways do we bring this corroborating evidence to bear in our talk? Well, here's another example, in this case extract 8, about a person K who's mentally ill and being talked about by other people, by a friend. Let's look at how independence is being established here, and perhaps also how stake is being managed. So here's this extract. K is mentally ill. In this extract, the writer explains, or the speaker explains, how she came to realise that her friend K was developing a psychiatric disorder. And in fact, there are 3 stages to this. The first, the speaker says, we would go to the beach or pool on a hot day, and I would sort of dip in and lie in the sun. while K insisted that she had to swim 30 lengths. So we can see, first of all, slight eccentricity here, really hot day, rather than just not doing very much. K is swimming 30 lengths of the pool. Second example then follows. She goes on to say, a mutual friend, Trudy, who was majoring in English, looked over one of her essays and told me afterwards, she writes like a 12-year-old. I think there's something wrong with her. So a little story about a mutual friend, Trudy, talking about K as well, and perhaps giving some sense that something was wrong here. And then the speaker goes on to say, later, K's mother noticed that K was unable to put on a teapot cover correctly. She would not reverse the position to make it fit, but would simply keep slamming it down on the pot, trying to force it in, you might say. So what's going on here? How are these three different phases of the talk about K establishing independence and corroboration? Well, the first thing to notice is that the conclusion that K is mentally ill is supported by two other people. It's not just what the speaker says, it's what Trudy says, it's what K's mother says. So we have some independent voices here. It's not just me that's saying this, others are saying the same kind of things. But also notice at the same time stake is being minimised as well. The people who are saying these things, I mean, I might be biased against K as being mentally ill because she's upset me or something like that, but Trudy and K's mother wouldn't be. Trudy is a mutual friend. Of course, her mother is her mother, and you expect the mother to be on her side as well. So here are two other voices whose stake is minimised because they're meant to be sympathetic and supportive kinds of people to K. So we've got both the independent voices and we've got the stake being minimised by those descriptions of mother and mutual friend. There's another way that we can actually try and emphasise the factuality, the factualness of what we're saying. And that is through giving detailed descriptions of things. We add in elements of detail that could only be there, that could only be the case if what we're saying is the truth in some way. And here's an example of somebody else doing that, examining extract number 9. I've called it Connie Ignored Me. It's actually from a marriage guidance session. The description itself is quite intense but packed with detail. Who was there, where they sat, the exact words that Connie said and so on. So let's look at how that level of detail helps things appear factual. So here's the extract. Taken, as I said, from a marriage guidance session between the speaker Jim and his partner Connie. Although Connie doesn't say anything in this particular text, it's just Jim speaking about an event. It describes a time they met sometime, they met some friends in a pub. Jim actually says they sat on the other side, and Connie allegedly ignored Jim. Here's what Jim says. Connie sat beside Caroline in the pub, and I sat further back. So Connie was split between us. They sat in on the other side. The only words Connie spoke to me for the rest of the evening was, get another drink. And then he says it again quietly, get another drink. So there's a kind of emphasis going on here. Now, how is this detailed description emphasising the reliability of what's being said? Well, first of all, the detailed description itself implies that the witness was in a good position to see the events and can remember them well. And so it constructs the witness, Jim this is in this case, as a reliable witness. Details are described in a bare fact way. So Connie's talk on line 8, get another drink, as if it was an exact quotation of what Connie said. Claims that it's the exact words rather than some kind of summary. So it's not Connie asked me to get her another drink, it was just the bare fact of get another drink, clearly what Connie said. And that's the implication, that it's a direct quotation. So all of these forms of discourse are minimising the interpretation of the event and suggesting an independent and objective fact that Jim is telling us about this particular event of having a drink with some friends. So to conclude then, factual talk is a complex achievement. There are all kinds of things that speakers have to do to try to convince the listeners that they are reliable, that things are as they say they are, and so on. We have to show we have no stake or interest, or at least to minimise that stake or interest. We have to counter the possibilities that the hearer might think we have a stake. And we have to try and make our claims independent of ourselves, either by bringing in other speakers or by including kinds of levels of detail and evidence that make it clear that we are accurate reporters. So we use corroborating evidence, detail and disclaimers and so on as some of these factualisation devices. These are just some of them. There are lots more that Potter talks about in his book Representing Reality.